There once was a woman who grabbed a stranger in the market square and called him her husband. She was a runaway peasant girl in a desperate moment where being caught meant their certain death. Her last hope was to cling to an unfamiliar wandering scholar who was quietly eating a bowl of thin stew at a roadside stall. But if this tale had merely ended as a simple escape, it would not have been passed down through the centuries to this very day. The moment the true identity of that scholar is revealed, the story changes entirely. A peasant girl fleeing barefoot, and a man eating his stew while hiding his true face. The story of that day, when their two fates collided, begins now. In a remote manor village of the kingdom, at the hour when the dawn mist was swallowing the fields, the heavy kitchen door of the lord's estate opened without a sound. Slipping through the crack of the door were the bare feet of an 18-year-old runaway peasant girl named Clara. She had no time to put on shoes, and in the pitch blackness, there was certainly no chance to search for her worn leather boots. With nothing clutched in her hand but an old silver hairpin left behind by her mother, Eleanor, Clara began to run without looking back. The freezing morning air pierced her lungs, and the wet, freezing mud seeped between her bare toes, but she could not stop. If she were caught, it would be the end. The reason Clara was running with such fierce desperation was due to something that had happened only a few hours prior. That night, while passing behind the main hall of the manor, Clara heard voices leaking from the Lord's chambers. "You mean Clara? I hear the wench has a pretty face and even knows how to read, so we can demand a much higher price for her." It was the voice of her master, the corrupt manor lord Giles. The man he was speaking to was Silas, a wealthy city merchant who had traveled down from the capital. Clara was about to be sold off as an unwilling bride to this man whose face she did not even know. Hearing them put a price on a human life as if she were a mere piece of livestock. Clara's legs moved before her mind could even process it. I must run. If not tonight, there will never be another chance. In truth, there was only one thing in this world that Clara could not bear to leave behind. The silver hairpin left by her late mother, Eleanor. A few years ago, as Eleanor lay bedridden with a terrible illness, she pressed the pin into Clara's hand with her frail, bony fingers and said, "Never let go of this. It will change your fate." Engraved on one side of the silver pin were tiny, indecipherable letters. Clara knew how to read, but strangely, she could not decipher these particular markings. Eleanor closed her eyes for the final time, without ever explaining their meaning. And from that day on, Clara never let the hairpin leave her side. Her mother's final words, "It will change your fate." Clara still did not know what those words truly meant. She walked for 2 days, starving. She scrambled up forested hills, waded through muddy fields, and soaked her battered feet in icy streams to wash away the blood. By the time she finally reached the bustling market square, where the grand village fair was being held, it was the morning of the second day. The market square was overflowing with people. A baker was stacking warm honey cakes, a tinker was clattering his tools, and a merchant selling salted meats was shouting at the top of his lungs to draw in customers. Clara thought that if she could just blend into this chaotic crowd, she might be able to shake off her pursuers, even with her bloody bare feet and her face covered in dark mud. She hoped she would go unnoticed amidst the dust and clamor of the fair. Clara hid herself behind the baker's cart and let out a breathless sigh for the first time. But her relief did not last long. The heavy thud of horse hooves echoed from the edge of the market square. The Lord's brute servants, Garth and Cobb, had appeared at the fair on horseback.
"Lord Giles has given his orders. Bring back the runaway peasant girl at all costs."
Garth began shouting, questioning the merchants about Clara's appearance. An 18-year-old low-born wench, barefoot, with her hair tangled and loose. "Catch her, but do not bruise her face. It will lower her price." At Cobb's added warning, the eyes of the townsfolk immediately began scanning the crowd. Clara's heart seized in her chest. Crouched tightly behind the baker's cart, Clara could hear Garth's heavy footsteps and booming voice drawing closer and closer. One alleyway over, then 2 stalls away, and then right in front of her. There is the wench! Garth's roar tore through the market square. Clara leaped to her feet and broke into a dead sprint. Baskets spilled over, wooden tables were flipped, and people screamed as Clara ran like a madwoman deep into the narrow cobblestone alleys. Left, right, and left again. But the path suddenly ended. It was a dead end. From behind, the thundering footsteps of Garth and Cobb were closing in, and in front of her was nothing but a high stone wall. Absolute despair filled Clara's eyes. Right at that very second, a solitary figure caught her eye. Beneath the stone wall at the end of the street, in an alley, sat a shabby little soup stall, sitting alone on a wooden bench, quietly eating a bowl of thin stew, as if the world around him were completely safe. At peace was a man. He wore a worn linen cloak with his hood pushed back, looking every bit like a poor wandering scholar. Clara stared at him. The brute servants were charging up behind her with heavy wooden clubs, and Clara had absolutely no choices left. None at all. And so Clara ran. She ran toward that unfamiliar scholar with every ounce of strength she had left in her bones. And she threw herself directly into the man's arms. The clay bowl of stew shattered on the ground. The scholar's eyes went wide with shock, and a desperate sob tore from Clara's throat. "Please," Clara begged, her 2 hands gripping the rough fabric of the scholar's cloak. "Just pretend to be my husband, just this once. If you do, I might live." The scholar looked down at this woman. Her face was a mess of tears and dark mud. Blood was seeping from her bare feet, and her entire body was violently trembling. This scholar's name was Alden. Clara had no way of knowing why he had come to this remote village, nor did she know what secret lay hidden beneath his cloak. From the alleyway, Garth and Cobb were charging forward with their clubs raised, and Alden saw them coming, the trembling woman in his arms, the raging guards approaching, and a split second of judgment between them. Alden made his move. He wrapped his arms protectively around Clara and slowly turned to face the Lord's servants. "This woman is my wife." Alden's voice was low, yet it rang out with perfect clarity, even over the noise. of the market square? For what reason are you chasing another man's bride?" Garth panted heavily, his chest heaving as he shouted, "That wench is a runaway peasant from Lord Giles's estate. Step aside, scholar, or you'll regret it." But Alden did not retreat a single inch. "My wife? A peasant? To claim a free-born woman with a lawful certificate of marriage is a serf? Is that not a crime against the crown itself?" Garth hesitated. The scholar's sudden air of authority, his bold mention of the law, and the piercing sharpness of his gaze made the brute falter. "Then show us the marriage parchment, right here." To demand I produce a household parchment kept safely at home, right here in the mud of a market square? Your insolence knows no bounds. As Alden took one commanding step forward, the two servants instinctively took a step back. Seizing that brief opening, Alden grabbed Clara's hand and walked straight into it. The thickest part of the market crowd, Garth shouted something furiously from behind them, but his words were completely drowned out by the roar of the bustling fair. The two of them finally slipped out of the market square. Alden let go of Clara's hand and spoke. "You are safe now. Go on your way." He turned to leave, but at that moment, Clara's fragile voice reached him from behind. "I have nowhere to go." Alden's footsteps came to a halt. He stood there in silence for a long time. The woman's desperate confession that she had no place in the world gripped him by the ankles. In the end, he led Clara to a quiet stream on the outskirts of the market. As Clara sat by the bank, Alden looked at her feet and saw the agonizing proof of a 2-day run without boots. The soles were cracked with dried blood, and the tops of her feet were covered in jagged scratches from forest thorns. When Clara dipped her feet into the cold water, the clear stream quickly clouded with crimson. Alden watched this grim sight, hesitated for a moment, and finally asked, "Tell me your situation. What in God's name happened to you?" With her head bowed low, Clara began to speak. She told him how she had been born as a serf on the Lord's estate and lived there for 18 years. How she was on the verge of being sold as an unwilling bride to a wealthy city merchant, and how she had chosen to run. Her voice was calm and flat, but her bruised feet, submerged in the freezing water, were trembling violently. As Alden listened to Clara's tragic tale, his mind was racing with entirely different thoughts. In truth, Alden's arrival in this county was no accident. He carried a secret mission that he could not breathe a word of to anyone. A secret petition had reached the royal court, claiming that the local sheriff and the manor lord had conspired to steal the peasants' lands and double the kingdom's taxes. The man who had received the king's direct order to investigate this corruption as a royal assize justice was none other than Alden. Disguised as a poor wandering scholar, he had already been in this wretched village for a fortnight. But to think that the master of this runaway peasant, the very man he was investigating, Lord Giles. Cold, tactical calculations began turning in Alden's head. If I keep this woman close, I might be able to uncover the darkest secrets hidden within the Lord's estate. But at the same time, the moral question of whether it was right to use a desperate human being as a mere tool for his mission tugged uncomfortably at the corner of his conscience. After a long, heavy silence, Alden finally opened his mouth. "Let us pretend to be husband and wife for just a few days." Clara lifted her head and stared at Alden. "I have business to finish in this village. Once it is done, I will help you find a safe path forward." A shadow of suspicion flickered in Clara's eyes, but she knew perfectly well that she had no other choice. A barefoot, empty-handed runaway peasant girl? Where could she possibly go all alone? "But I have one condition." Alden looked straight into Clara's eyes as he spoke. "No matter what I do, you must never ask questions." Clara gazed into Alden's eyes for a moment before giving a slow nod. And just like that, with a simple stone bridge over a stream lying between them, a strange and fragile alliance was born. At that exact moment, the sound of a fist slamming violently against a heavy oak table echoed through the main hall of the Lord's estate. Having heard the report from his returning brute servant, Garth, Lord Giles' face was flushed a furious, boiling red. "What? A scholar claiming to be her husband?" "Yes, my lord." Right in front of a soup stall in the market square, the wretched scholar blocked our path, swearing the wench was his wife. Barking about marriage parchments? A filthy serf with a husband? A marriage parchment? What absolute madness! Lord Giles gritted his teeth. He had already promised to hand Clara over to Silas, the wealthy city merchant. The pouch of gold coins he was meant to receive in exchange was no small sum. Losing Clara meant losing a fortune, and worse. If rumors spread that a mere peasant had outsmarted her lord and escaped, his noble reputation would be dragged through the mud. "I shall go to the sheriff's court at once. I will have Sheriff Thorne issue a royal warrant for the capture of a runaway thrall." Lord Giles's eyes narrowed with wicked malice. "And we shall drag that scholar back here by his neck as well." Meanwhile, Alden and Clara were walking through the village, playing the part of husband and wife, walking side by side. The sight that greeted their eyes was the horrifying devastation of the county. Stone walls were crumbling, abandoned timber cottages had weeds sprouting through their thatched roofs, and children so starved their ribs showed through. Their skin sat in the mud. The granaries were completely empty, and the manor fields were overgrown with dead thistles. Clara spoke in a low whisper. It was never a village like this. It only became this way after Lord Giles began collecting double the taxes. Double? Yes. One tax for the crown and another separate tax straight into the Lord's coffers. If a man cannot pay, his land is seized. When his land is seized, he becomes a tenant farmer. And when he can no longer survive as a tenant, he is eventually forced into servitude as a peasant thrall. Clara's voice was flat and hollow, but Alden could feel the years of deep, festering rage buried within her words. Alden silently took in the landscape of the village. His face remained completely stoic. But somewhere deep inside his chest, an unbreakable resolve was hardening into steel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they rented a single room at a shabby roadside inn near the market square. Since they were pretending to be a married couple,
I could hardly ask for separate quarters. Standing face to face in the cramped, dimly lit room, an awkward silence flowed between the two of them.
Alden was the first to move. He took his long cloth bundle and laid it straight down the middle of the floor, drawing a line. "This side is my space, and that side is yours." Clara stared down at the makeshift boundary. Before the corners of her lips curled up just the slightest bit. It was the very first time Alden had seen this woman smile. A moment later, Alden reached into his cloak, pulled something out, and offered it out to Clara. It was a pair of sturdy leather shoes. "I bought them at the market square," he said. "Do not walk barefoot any longer." Clara took the leather shoes, staring down at them for a long time. In her 18 years living as a lowly peasant bound to the manor, not once had anyone ever worried about her bare, bleeding feet. "Thank you." Clara's voice trembled faintly. The night deepened, and Alden had fallen asleep. Clara quietly sat up and reached deep into the folds of her wool dress, pulling out the hidden heirloom. As she held the silver hairpin up to the moonlight seeping through the cracks in the wooden shutters, its sapphire tip gleamed with a soft indigo light. Tiny letters were engraved on one side of the silver pin. Clara narrowed her eyes and traced the script with her thumb, but she still could not read it. It was not common Latin, nor the everyday script of the realm, but rather some specialized cipher or ancient rune. Why had her mother, Eleanor, left this pin behind? What did she mean when she said it would change her fate? Clara clutched the hairpin to her chest and closed her eyes. The pale moonlight settled quietly over the two sleeping figures. But in truth, Alden was not asleep. After ensuring that Clara had drifted off, Alden silently slipped out of the cramped room and stood in the muddy courtyard of the roadside inn. From beneath his cloak, he drew out a heavy silver medallion bearing the king's crest of a rearing stallion, along with a sealed parchment bearing a stamp of red wax. Under the moonlight, he unrolled the royal decree. Investigate every detail of the corruption and extortion committed by the town, sheriff, and the manor lord of this shire, and bring them to justice. It was a direct command from the king. It had been a fortnight since he'd arrived in this forsaken region. Evidence was gathering little by little, but he still lacked the decisive blow. Alden's gaze drifted back toward the window of their rented room. What had that young woman seen within Lord Giles's manor hall? What secrets did she know? Yet he could not reveal his true identity. The very essence of an undercover royal inspector's duty was to move unseen in the shadows. Alden tucked the silver medallion and the sealed parchment back into his cloak and looked up at the moon. The next morning, Clara stepped out of the inn wearing her new leather shoes. Her expression was noticeably brighter, marveling at the sheer comfort of not walking barefoot. "Thank you. I truly never knew shoes could be this warm." Alden gave a gruff nod and asked, "Have you decided where you will go?" Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. Not yet." "Then walk with me a little longer," he said. Alden took the first step, and Clara followed behind him. Not side by side, but trailing half a pace back. As they walked, Clara was turning something over in her mind. Last night, when she thought he was asleep, she had shifted her weight and accidentally brushed against his cloth bundle. Something inside had gleamed, the heavy glint of silver caught in the moonlight. Could it have been a royal inspector's medallion? Meanwhile, Alden was also deep in thought as he walked. He remembered the faint ink stains lingering on Clara's fingertips last night. How could a lowly peasant girl have ink stains on her hands? Two people, both suspecting each other's secrets, yet pretending to know nothing. Under the morning sun, their strange companionship upon the dirt road truly began. A few days passed, and rumors began to spread through the muddy market square. Whispers claimed that the runaway peasant girl from Lord Giles's estate was parading around as the wife of some ragged, wandering scholar. The gossip passed from the baker woman to the old blacksmith, and from the blacksmith to the traveling merchant. Isn't that the girl from Lord Giles' manor? Did she have a husband? A peasant bound to the land, taking a husband so freely? That scholar is suspicious, too. His clothes are nothing but rags, yet he speaks like a high-born nobleman. Whenever they passed through the market, the stares of the townsfolk clung to them, making Clara's shoulders shrink further inward. Alden spoke in a low voice. Let us avoid the market square from now on. It is not wise to draw attention. Alden had already scouted a vacant thatched cottage on the outskirts of the town. The previous tenant had long since fled. The winter famine, leaving the house empty for years. Weeds sprouted from the thatched roof, and a thick layer of dust coated the wooden floorboards. Still, it could keep out the wind and rain, and the stone hearth was intact. Clara naturally set to work. She swept the dirt yard, built a fire in the hearth, fetched water from the stream, and scrubbed the small kitchen area clean. By day, Alden maintained his guise as a wandering parish scholar, roaming various corners of the village. He sat in the alehouse, listening to the local chatter, spoke with the ragged commoners, and jotted things down in a small ledger. To anyone looking from the outside, they were the very picture of a newlywed couple. Yet, inside the damp cottage, the cloth bundle still lay on the floor between them, serving as an unspoken boundary. At that exact hour, within the sheriff's court, Lord Giles and Sheriff Thorne sat facing each other. Their alliance was not a recent development. From the very first year Sheriff Thorne took office, Lord Giles had lined his pockets with silver coins, securing the sheriff's backing. In return, Thorne turned a blind eye to the Lord's ruthless extortion of the serfs. It was an unbreakable bond forged by mutual blackmail. Sheriff Thorne, is it not the law of the land that anyone harboring a runaway peasant shall face the same severe punishment? Lord Giles said, setting down his goblet of mead. Arrest that vagabond scholar as well. Charge him with aiding and abetting a fugitive. Sheriff Thorne hesitated for a moment, but he understood the dark implication. In Lord Giles's eyes, it was a silent threat. Refuse this favor, and all their past corruption might suddenly come to light. Very well, I shall dispatch my deputies to scour the town. With the sheriff's command given, the heavily armed deputies scattered throughout the village like a pack of hounds. That evening, inside the vacant thatched cottage, Alden was organizing his documents. He had gathered evidence from his rounds through the village, the grievances of the starving peasants, the inflated tax records, and the long lists of manor fields unjustly seized. But the sheer volume of parchment was overwhelming, and sorting it was no easy task. Just then, Clara quietly approached and sat beside him. "Shall I help you?" she asked. Alden turned his head to look at her. Clara was already holding a quill. Half doubting, Alden slid a piece of parchment toward her, and Clara's hand began to move gracefully across the page. Alden's eyes widened at the sight of her script. It was perfectly formed, clear and precise merchant numerals. But that was not all. The speed at which Clara read through the account records and summarized the key points was extraordinary. How could a mere peasant girl possess such literacy? Clara paused her quill and answered quietly, "My mother taught me, in secret." With those words, Clara spoke of her mother, Eleanor, for the very first time. Eleanor had originally been a noblewoman from an esteemed, well-known house. But one day, their family was suddenly accused of treason against the crown. Her father was beheaded, and her mother was stripped of her title, condemned to a life of servitude, dragged to Lord Giles's estate as a lowly thrall. She had given birth to Clara while toiling in the mud. As she taught me my letters, my mother always told me this. Clara's voice grew thin and fragile. She said that as long as I knew how to read, I would never forget that I am a human being, not a beast of burden. She recalled the image of her sickly mother, unable to afford even a scrap of parchment, using a stylus to scratch letters into a cheap wax tablet to teach her young daughter. Tears pooled in the corners of Clara's eyes. Alden listened in absolute silence, but his grip on his own quill tightened until his knuckles turned white. After Clara had fallen asleep, Alden stepped out alone into the dirt yard of the cottage. The night sky was a vast canopy of spilling stars. When he first met Clara, Alden had viewed her merely as a useful asset for his mission. She was someone who knew the inner workings of Lord Giles' manor, a tool that could help him gather evidence. But tonight, after hearing her story, he felt deeply ashamed of his cold calculations. The daughter of a falsely accused nobleman, forced into servitude, bearing a child into slavery, who was then nearly sold off as an unwilling bride. It was a world where the heavy iron chains of social class choked the life out of generations. Was this truly just? Alden slowly clenched his fists. The heavy burden that came with his secret title of Royal Justice felt
unusually crushing this night. The following day, the sheriff's deputies descended upon the village. They began pounding on doors, shouting threats at the frightened commoners. Anyone found harboring the runaway peasant shall be punished with 50 lashes. Of the whip! If you know anything, speak now! From among the terrified villagers, one man finally broke. With a trembling voice, he confessed that a strange couple had taken up residence in the vacant thatched cottage on the outskirts of town. A deputy's eyes gleamed with malice. The empty cottage on the outskirts, eh? Good. Let's go. 3 deputies immediately turned their heavy boots toward the edge of town. The villager who had informed on them hung his head in shame
as the armed men marched past. His face was a mixture of deep guilt and raw terror. But faced with the threat of 50 lashes, very few men could keep their silence. News of the approaching deputies arrived just in time, carried by the frantic footsteps of Martha, a local village woman. "Master Scholar, the sheriff's men are heading this way. You must flee at once." Clara reacted first. She rushed to Alden to relay the warning, and within moments, the two snatched up their belongings and slipped out the back path. In the midst of their desperate escape, Alden untied his bundle of documents, pulled out a few critical parchments, and shoved them into Clara's hands. "They might search my pack. You must hide these." Without a second thought, Clara folded the parchments and tucked them deep inside the bodice of her wool dress. The two vaulted over the low stone wall, behind the cottage, and scrambled up the forested trail. By the time the deputies kicked open the door to the thatched house, the only proof that anyone had been there was the fading warmth of the hearth fire. Having sprinted deep into the woods, the two hid behind a massive mossy boulder, gasping for breath. While Alden crept forward to scout the perimeter, Clara began to repack his hastily tied bundle. As she did, her fingers brushed against something. The cold, hard touch of heavy silver. Clara pulled back the rough linen cloth, and there it lay, the medallion, the object she had only glimpsed in the dim. The light of the inn was now unmistakably clear. It was a silver disc the size of her palm, deeply engraved with the crest of a rearing stallion, with Latin words carved beneath it. Clara knew how to read. She recognized exactly what it was in an instant. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. This man is a royal justice. Just then, Alden returned from the tree line. He saw the silver medallion resting in Clara's hands and the wide, shocked stare in her eyes. Alden froze. A heavy silence fell over them, as if time itself had turned to ice. Clara was the first to speak. "I saw nothing." She quickly wrapped the medallion back in the linen cloth, shoved it deep into the bundle, and handed it back to Alden. A long silence lingered between them. Alden took the bundle, his eyes locked onto Clara's. "Thank you." Within those two words rested a weight of gratitude and trust that no language could fully express. They were no longer merely a fake husband and wife. They were two souls who had uncovered each other's deepest secrets, and who had silently vowed to protect them. After a moment, Alden asked her, "By any chance, did you ever see the granary ledgers at Lord Giles' manor?" Clara answered without hesitation, "I did not just see them. I was the one who wrote them for him." Alden's eyes flew wide open. That night, in their hidden woodland sanctuary, the two sat facing each other across a small, crackling campfire. Drawing upon her sharp memory, Clara began to detail the contents of Lord Giles' private ledgers. The harvest taxes were collected in two separate streams, she explained. One ledger was the official record sent to the sheriff's court. The other was a private ledger for the grain Lord Giles hoarded in his own secret storehouses. "You mean to say he kept a double set of books?" Alden asked. "Yes. He would record a meager tax yield in the official ledger, while in reality, he squeezed double the grain from the peasants and pocketed the vast difference." I was the one forced to copy out both ledgers for him.
Alden pulled out the evidence he had painstakingly gathered and laid it out piece by piece.
The tales of double taxation whispered by starving farmers, the long list of seized manor fields, the rumors of the dark pact between the sheriff and the lord heard in the alehouses. As Clara's testimony interlocked with Alden's findings, the scattered fragments of the puzzle finally formed a complete, damning picture. If I have your testimony, I can bring justice to this entire shire. Across the flickering campfire, Alden's eyes shone with fierce determination. But Clara did not immediately nod. If I testify, what will become of me? It was an inevitable question. Clara was a runaway peasant. In the eyes of the king's law, the word of a low-born serf was lighter than the ink spilled on the parchment, and the testimony of a fugitive slave was worth absolutely nothing. That was the brutal reality of the realm's justice. Alden sat in heavy silence for a long time before he finally spoke. I will restore your status as a free-born woman. You have my word. Clara looked at Alden across the dying embers. Her eyes held a desperate desire to believe him, fighting against the harsh reality she had always known. I do not put my faith in promises, she said, lowering her gaze to the ashes. A serf does not live to see promises kept. But right now, you are the only hope I have. So I will do it. It was not a declaration of absolute trust, but it was enough. It was a vow that they would fight this battle together. It was the bitter, freezing hour just before dawn. The campfire had burned down to nothing, and the biting chill of the forest floor seeped into their bones. Clara curled into a tight ball, shivering violently in her sleep. Alden watched her in silence for a moment. Quietly, he unfastened his heavy wool cloak and draped it gently over her shoulders. Slowly, her shivering ceased. A short while later, Clara opened her eyes, feeling an unfamiliar, heavy warmth covering her. She reached up and touched the thick wool of Alden's cloak. Her hand lingered there. For 18 years, living under the yoke of forced servitude, enduring the freezing winter nights without complaint, was simply the reality of her existence. No one had ever offered her an extra blanket, let alone a single word of warmth. To Clara, the weight of this rough wool, the cloak felt more precious than a queen's velvet. She pulled the fabric tighter around her neck and closed her eyes again. A short distance away, Alden sat leaning against a mossy stone, watching her. Clara pretended not to notice his gaze. It was a quiet dawn, where it was easier for both of them to pretend they felt nothing at all. Meanwhile, inside the manor hall, the hearth fire burned late into the night. Giles sat at his heavy oak table, his corrupt steward by his side, crafting a wicked lie. "What do the villagers call this wandering scholar?" Giles demanded. "The folk in the market square call him Alden, my lord," the steward replied. A cruel smile stretched across Giles's face. "Excellent. Draft a writ. State that this Alden is an accomplice in aiding a fugitive." "No, go further." Giles snatched the quill, dipped it in dark ink, and began to write the lies himself. "State that this Alden is no free-born. parish scholar, but a runaway serf from a distant northern shire. The steward's eyes widened in shock, but under the terrifying glare of the manor lord, he dared not speak a word of defiance. Throughout the night, ink was dried, stolen wax seals were pressed, and the edges of the parchment were carefully worn to look authentic. By daybreak, 2 flawless, damning forged writs lay upon the table. Giles folded the parchment and laughed softly. Now, those 2 are finished. The following day, Alden walked through the muddy lanes of the village alone. He sought out the peasants who had been bled dry by Giles, hoping to gather their testimonies. But fear kept their doors barred and their lips sealed. "I cannot speak," one man whispered through a cracked shutter. "Cross the Lord, and my whole family starves in the winter." "You know this, scholar. Why do you ask? No one in this shire can touch him." Door after door closed in Alden's face. His heart grew heavy with frustration. Just as he reached the edge of the village, near a crumbling thatched cottage, a withered hand reached out and tugged urgently at his sleeve. "Scholar, come here, quickly." It was Tom, an elderly peasant. The old man looked around with terrified eyes before whispering in the shadows, "That wicked lord stole my family's fields, 30 good acres of planting soil. I have the proof, but the true parchment, the original deed, is locked away in the sheriff's record room. Giles took it and hid it there." Alden's eyes sharpened. The definitive proof of their corruption lay inside the sheriff's hall. But to search the record room meant breaking into an estate, guarded by the sheriff's deputies. It was a task that demanded risking one's life. By dusk, Alden and Clara returned to their temporary hideout, a ruined stone monastery deep in the woods. Beneath the peeling frescoes and the thick cobwebs of the abandoned chapel, Alden shared the grim news. The true land registry and the stolen tax ledgers are kept in the sheriff's record room. If only I could lay eyes on them. Before he could finish his thought, Clara spoke up. "I will go." Alden turned his head, staring at her in disbelief. "I know the servant's path behind the hall," Clara explained. "I delivered goods to the kitchens for Giles countless times. I know which alleyways stay hidden from the night watchman's lantern." Alden shook his head fiercely. "No! If you are caught, it is over. A runaway serf breaking into the sheriff's hall is not a crime punished by a whipping. That is a crime punished by the gallows." Clara met his gaze without a trace of hesitation. "If I am caught anywhere, it is the gallows for me anyway. Hiding in the shadows will not change my fate." Alden kept his mouth tightly shut for a long time. The silence in the ruined chapel was deafening. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. "On one condition," Alden said, his voice deadly serious. "I will wait by the outer stone wall. If you are not out before the church bell tolls the hour, I am coming inside. An hour is more than enough." Alden reached into his tunic and produced a small vial of ink, a quill, and a few sheets of blank parchment, handing them to her. "Do not steal the ledgers. If they go missing, they will hunt us down immediately. Only copy the most damning numbers." Clara reached out to take the quill. In that fleeting second, her fingers brushed against his. Alden pulled his hand back first, turning away to hide his face. but the startling warmth of his touch lingered on Clara's fingertips. The pale moonlight spilling through the broken roof stretched their shadows, slung across the cold stone floor. It was the dead of night. Clara reached the stone wall behind the sheriff's hall just as a thick cloud swallowed the moon. Relying on the muscle memory of her years of servitude, she hoisted herself over the stones. She slipped silently past the narrow gap by the latrines, rounded the back of the granary, and arrived at the heavy oak door of the record room. The main iron lock was secured, but Clara knew the side window's iron latch was loose on the inside. Using a thin twig, she lifted the latch and pushed the wooden shutter open. The moment she stepped inside, her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might leap from her throat. She dared not strike a flint to light a candle. Relying solely on the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks, she ran her hands over the shelves, flipping through the heavy, leather-bound ledgers. Manor fields, village tithes, serf registries. Clara's hands moved swiftly. She found the hidden numbers, dipped her quill, and began to write. The blank parchment quickly filled with the dark ink of undeniable truth. She did not know how much time had passed. She was entirely consumed by the task when the heavy crunch of boots on gravel echoed from outside. Step, step, step. It was the night watchman. She held her breath and pressed her body flat against the cold stone wall. Behind the wooden racks, the yellow glow of a lantern sliced through the gaps in the door. The heavy iron hinges groaned. The watchman leaned his head inside, sweeping the room with his gaze. Hidden behind the shelves, Clara did not dare to exhale. She felt as though the frantic beating of her heart was echoing off the walls, loud enough to wake the dead. The lantern light swept across the floor, brushed the wooden shelves, and lingered in the dark corners. The agonizing seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, the watchman pulled back, and the heavy door shut with a solid thud. Only then did Clara release her trembling breath. She had not even realized that cold sweat was pouring down her spine. Tucking the copied parchment securely into her bodice, she slipped back out the window. The moment she dropped over the outer wall into the wet grass, Alden stepped out from the shadows. "You are safe." His voice was thick with overwhelming relief. Clara pulled the parchment from her dress and handed it to him. Alden angled the paper toward the moonlight. As his eyes scanned the numbers, his jaw tightened into a hard line. "This is no simple greed," Alden whispered, his voice dark and heavy. "They are hoarding the king's silver. This is high treason against the crown authority. If the crown sees this, heads will roll." Clara looked up at him. The danger they had stepped into was far greater than she had ever imagined. Dawn broke, but it brought no comfort. Clara was the first to realize something was terribly wrong. There were no birds singing. The forest was unnaturally, suffocatingly quiet. Clara crept to the cracked wooden doors of the monastery and peered out. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing among the ancient trees, blocking every possible path, were the sheriff's deputies. They were armed with iron-tipped spears. Not 3 men, but half a dozen.
They were completely surrounded. Clara's voice trembled as she called out, "Alden! Outside!" Alden rushed to the gap, looked out, and cursed under his breath.
The watchman must have noticed a misplaced ledger. Or perhaps the morning dew had betrayed their footprints in the mud. Alden looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. There was nowhere left to run. The heavy chapel doors burst open, splintering off their hinges. "Hold fast!" Alden pushed Clara behind him, stepping forward to shield her, but 4 deputies swarmed them at once. They tackled Alden to the stone floor, violently twisting his arms behind his back. Clara screamed as rough hands seized her. From the doorway stepped a massive, cruel figure. It was Garth. A wicked grin stretched across Garth's scarred face as he looked down at Clara. "Aye, that is her, the runaway wench belonging to my master." Rough hemp ropes were bound tightly around Clara's wrists, biting into her skin. They did the same to Alden. "Drag the beggar scholar along too," Garth spat. "Aiding a fugitive serf is a crime against the Lord." They were hauled out of the ruined chapel without mercy. As they were dragged down the rocky forest path, Clara's worn leather shoe caught on a root and tore off. There was no time to retrieve it. Only days ago, Alden had bought her those shoes to protect her feet. Now she was barefoot once more. The muddy market square before the sheriff's court was already swarming with villagers. Word had spread through the ale houses like wildfire. The market folk had gathered to witness the fate of the runaway serf. Clara and Alden were dragged into the courtyard, bound like animals. Clara's linen gown trailed in the mud, her hair a tangled mess across her pale face. But beneath the dirt and exhaustion, her eyes remained fiercely unbroken. Standing on the wooden steps of the hall was Giles. He stood with his arms crossed, wearing the victorious smile of a man who had already won. Beside him, seated in a high-backed wooden chair, was Thorn, the corrupt sheriff. In the center of the courtyard, the whipping post and heavy leather flails stood ready. Giles stepped down and sneered at Clara. "Did you truly think you could escape me? You ungrateful wretch!" Clara's lips trembled, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a sound. Giles reached into his belt and produced the 2 rolled parchments, handing them up to Thorn. "My lord sheriff, here is the deed, proving this girl is my rightful property. And here is the truth about this man who calls himself a scholar." Thorn unrolled the parchment with a theatrical sigh. "It seems this man is no free-born scholar. He is a runaway serf from a northern estate. 2 fugitive peasants, playing husband and wife, breaking into my hall to steal documents." Alden roared against his bindings. "Lies! I am no serf. That writ is a forgery." But the forged parchment was a masterpiece of deception. It bore a stolen seal, precise dates, and flawless script. Thorn looked down at the parchment and nodded sagely. He had never intended to seek the truth anyway. "The law is clear," Thorn pronounced, his voice echoing off the stone walls. 30 lashes at the whipping post for both runaways. Then they shall be returned to their rightful master. A violent storm raged inside Alden's mind, hidden deep within the lining of his. The tunic was his royal seal, the silver medallion of the king's undercover inspector. If he revealed it now, this nightmare would end instantly. He could save Clara, sever her ropes, and bring Giles and Thorn to their knees. But the moment the silver flashed in the daylight, his secret mission would die. Thorn and Giles would immediately hide the real ledgers. Months of painstaking investigation would then be lost. The chance to bring justice to hundreds of starving peasants in this shire would be lost forever. Save one innocent girl and doom 100 souls, or sacrifice her flesh to save the realm. This was the agonizing choice tearing Alden apart. His bound hands twitched toward his tunic, stopped, then strained against the ropes again. He was suffocating in his own helplessness. "Execute the 30 lashes on the runaway girl," Thorn commanded lazily. Rough hands dragged Clara to the wooden whipping post. They bound her wrists to the iron ring above her head. The sheriff's deputy stepped forward, raising a thick, hardened leather whip high into the cold morning air. Crack! The heavy leather struck Clara's back with a sickening, muffled thud. Clara bit down on her lips so hard she tasted blood. She swallowed her scream, refusing to give them the pleasure of her pain. Crack! The second blow fell. Clara's body violently jolted against the ropes. Clara trembled, but remained silent. Alden's hands balled into fists, his nails biting into his palms until blood seeped out, though he felt no pain. At the crack of the third lash, a low groan finally escaped Clara's lips. Tears began to well in Alden's eyes. After the third blow fell, Clara raised her head. Blood stained the back of her linen gown, yet her eyes locked onto Alden. She moved her pale lips. No sound came out, but Alden could read the words perfectly. "Do not take it out." Clara knew. She knew he had the royal medallion hidden deep within his tunic, and she knew that pulling it out would put an end to all of this. But Clara was not choosing to save herself. Shivering in agony beneath the whip, she thought of the hundreds of wronged peasants suffering across this manor. She knew there was something far greater at stake than the lashes falling upon her own back. A single tear rolled down Alden's cheek. The fourth and fifth lashes fell in quick succession. Clara could no longer muster even a groan. Her fingers, twisted tightly in the ropes, turned deathly pale. Suddenly, Alden surged to his feet. Every eye in the sheriff's courtyard snapped toward him. Lord Giles narrowed his eyes, and Sheriff Thorn scowled. But Alden's hand did not reach into his tunic. Instead of the royal seal, he unleashed his voice. "Halt! I have something to say." His booming shout silenced the muddy courtyard. The deputy's arm froze midair with the heavy whip, and Sheriff Thorn raised an eyebrow. Alden took a step forward. "You claim this woman is a runaway peasant bound to your estate." "Very well. Then produce the writ of bondage, the original parchment." Alden's counterattack began with the law of the realm. By the king's law, to punish a runaway serf, the original sealed writ must be presented to the court. Copies or forged ledgers hold no sway. Sheriff Thorn flinched. Alden turned his piercing gaze to Lord Giles. "Furthermore, my lord, you claimed that I, too, am a runaway bondsman. If that is so, what is the name of my original master? And where is the original writ binding me?" For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed Lord Giles' face. He had prepared forged documents for Clara, but he had not anticipated needing a fictitious master and a forged parchment for Alden so soon. If you give me but a few days. Are you saying you do not have it? Alden's sharp words pierced the cold courtyard air. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of commoners. The scholar speaks true. The Lord has lost his tongue. Sheriff Thorne wavered. "Lord Giles, do you possess the original writ or not?" Lord Giles ground his teeth. "I shall bring it by tomorrow morning." Sheriff Thorne pondered for a moment before nodding. "Very well. The execution of the sentence is temporarily halted. I shall verify the original parchment tomorrow morning and resume the punishment then." Clara was dragged down from the whipping post. Blood soaked her back, and her legs gave way, unable to support her weight. Yet her eyes remained fiercely alive. Still bound by thick ropes, Alden and Clara were hauled away to the tasseled dungeon. They had one night. For Alden and Clara, it was a night in a cold stone cell. For Lord Giles, it was a night of desperate forgery. The dungeon was cramped and pitch black. There was nothing but damp earth and a thin scattering of rotting straw, with no blankets and no hearth fire to keep the bitter chill at bay. Clara tried to lean against the stone wall, but let out a sharp gasp. The moment her torn back touched the cold stone, it felt as though her flesh had caught fire. Alden moved closer and began tearing the sleeves of his linen tunic. With the long strips of cloth, he carefully dabbed the blood seeping from Clara's wounds. As Clara bit her lip to endure the stinging pain, she noticed Alden's hands trembling slightly. "Why did you not reveal the royal seal?" Clara asked in a weak whisper. "Because you told me not to. Is that a good enough reason?" "Because of me. You are locked in this dungeon too." Alden gently wrapped the makeshift bandages around her shoulders and replied, "You are not the only one who matters." "But you do matter." Clara looked up at Alden's face. The pale moonlight filtering through the iron grate illuminated half of his features. Whether the emotion swimming in his eyes was pity, guilt, or something far deeper, Clara dared not give it a name. After a long silence, Alden spoke first. "I was born in the capital city." Clara turned her head to look at him. This was the first time he had ever spoken of his own past. "Are you of noble birth?" "No, we were a poor family, scholars in name only. My father was a humble parish teacher, paid in nothing but a few sacks of barley." Alden's voice flowed evenly in the dark. "When I went to take the royal examinations, the discrimination began at the castle gates. The sons of wealthy noblemen were given grand seats in the great hall, while lowly scholars like myself were shoved into the drafty corners. Even when we submitted our parchments, it was common practice for the lords to toss them into the fire just by reading our common surnames. Yet you passed and became the king's man," Clara said softly. "Reading and writing were all I knew. I simply believed that if I failed 10 times, I would pass.
On the 11th, Clara asked quietly, "Is that why you do this work? For the wronged and the powerless?" Alden fell silent for a moment before answering. It was... His words stopped there. Alden looked at Clara, but he did not, or could not, say the next words. Beneath the moonlight, a heavy silence settled between them. Two sitting side by side, a silence that held far more than words ever could. Clara reached into the folds of her wool dress and pulled something out. The indigo jade hairpin. The sheriff's deputies had searched her, but they had not found the heirloom she had meticulously sewn deep into the lining of her skirt. "Could you look at this?" Clara handed the hairpin to Alden. "My mother, Eleanor, left this to me. There are words carved into it, but I could never read them." Alden took the hairpin and held it up to the moonlight streaming through the grate. Tiny letters were etched into one side of the jade. Alden's eyes slowly widened. "This..." His tone shifted entirely. "This is a royal seal of office. It bears the title of a king's chancellor. The king's high council." "The high council?" "The royal court that handles treaties with foreign realms. A king's chancellor is a high-ranking noble. This means someone in your mother's family served directly under the king." Clara's mouth parted in shock. Her mother, Eleanor, had only ever said she was a fallen noblewoman. She had never spoken of the specific details of their house. Pieces of memory began to snap together rapidly in Alden's mind. "I once read a chronicle in the royal archives. Decades ago, a noble family in this very shire was falsely accused of treason. The charge was that a king's chancellor had used forged letters to plot a rebellion against the crown. Even then, there were whispers of a frame-up, but they were crushed by the power of their political rivals, and the family was condemned to ruin." Clara's hands began to shake. "If your mother's house is indeed that family, we can petition the crown for restoration." "Restoration? To clear them of the false charge of treason. If a petition is brought before the king's court and their innocence is proven, your family's honor will be restored. And..." Alden looked deeply into Clara's eyes. "You would no longer be a runaway peasant. You would be recognized as a noblewoman." Tears spilled from Clara's eyes. In that moment, she finally understood why Eleanor had told her never to let go of this hairpin. Why she had promised it would one day change her fate. Anticipating the day the truth would be brought to light. Her mother had carved the absolute proof into this jade and left it to her daughter. As Clara wiped her tears away, the look in her eyes transformed. It was no longer a gaze filled with sorrow, but one burning with fierce resolve. Alden began to lay out their strategy for the morning's trial. Lord Giles will spend the night forging the writ of bondage. But forgery always leaves a blind spot. Alden used a small twig to draw on the dirt floor, as he explained. "I will use the king's law to attack the flaws in his parchment. When I do, you must testify about the double taxation recorded in the Lord's hidden ledger." "And then?" Clara asked. Alden touched the chest of his tunic, where the royal medallion rested. "At the very end, I will reveal this." Clara looked at him with wide eyes. "By tomorrow,
we will have cornered them with enough proof. That is when it will strike the hardest. Only after we have completely sealed off every rat hole Sheriff Thorne and Lord Giles might use to escape. The two pressed their heads together, finalizing their battle plan as the fateful night deepened. At that exact hour, the manor hall of Lord Giles was ablaze with candlelight. Lord Giles and his steward were working through the night, fabricating the forged documents. They crafted a fake writ of bondage for Clara and a fictitious parchment to condemn Alden as a runaway serf. They stamped it with a stolen wax seal, singed the edges of the parchment to make it look aged, and carefully thinned the ink. At a glance, the forgeries were nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. But Lord Giles did not stop there. Destroy the evidence, just to be certain. Lord Giles ordered his steward. They dragged the heavy, leather-bound ledgers detailing years of extortion and stolen grain from the vault, manor desk, and began locking them into the deepest iron vault. The ledgers rested safely in the cold darkness, completely hidden. Lord Giles stared at the iron vault and muttered, "By tomorrow morning, it is over." However, Lord Giles was entirely unaware of one crucial fact. The core contents of those very ledgers had already been meticulously copied by Clara's own hand. Back in the dungeon, the gray light of pre-dawn began to creep through the iron bars. Clara and Alden sat side by side, leaning against the cold stone wall. Though their faces were pale and exhausted from a sleepless night of plotting, their eyes were sharp and alive. Clara asked quietly, "When today is over, what will happen to me?" Alden kept his mouth shut for a moment. Both knew they could not guarantee the outcome of today's trial. Revealing the royal medallion would flip the board. But there was no predicting what desperate, bloody measures Sheriff Thorne and Lord Giles might resort to. After a long silence, Alden finally answered, "Whatever happens, I will be by your side." Clara looked at Alden, and for the first time since they met, a genuine, heartfelt smile graced her lips. As the morning light spilled through the dungeon grate, their two shadows stretched across the dirt floor, merging into one. When morning broke, the townsfolk began to swarm the muddy market square and the sheriff's courtyard once more. There were even more commoners than the day before. Rumors that the trial of the runaway peasant girl and the strange wandering scholar was resuming had spread from one end of the village to the other. Sheriff Thorne took his seat upon the high wooden chair, with his deputies lining up on either side. The whipping post and the heavy leather whips were readied once again. Then Lord Giles strode into the courtyard with a leisurely, arrogant gait, tucked inside his velvet doublet, were the forged parchments he had spent the night perfecting. A confident smirk played on his lips. "Sheriff Thorne, I have brought the original writs, as promised." Sheriff Thorne nodded. A thick, suffocating tension settled over the courtyard. From the dark depths of the dungeon, Clara and Alden were dragged out into the cold morning air. But something was different from yesterday. They were still bound tightly by thick hemp ropes. Yet the look in their eyes had completely changed. Alden held his head high, his gaze sweeping over the courtyard with absolute authority, while Clara looked straight ahead, her eyes trembling but utterly unbroken. Sheriff Thorne declared his ruling. We shall resume the trial from yesterday. Lord Giles, present the original writs of bondage. Lord Giles pulled the rolled parchments from his doublet. The painstakingly forged documents unrolled in his hands, masquerading perfectly as ancient, sealed truths. Just as he was about to hand them to Sheriff Thorne, Alden stepped forward. Before you read that parchment, there is a question I must ask first. A heavy silence fell over the muddy market square. It was a stillness so profound that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The final battle was about to begin. Alden spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the courtyard toward Sheriff Thorne. Before you read that parchment, Sheriff, there is one detail I must verify. Sheriff Thorne waved his hand as if swatting a nuisance, but the eyes of every commoner in the courtyard were fixed upon Alden. He could not simply ignore him. Speak then, Thorne muttered. By the laws of the realm, a writ of bondage must bear the wax seal of the sheriff who governed at the time of its drafting. This young woman was born 18 winters ago. Therefore, the seal pressed into that wax must belong to the sheriff who held this seat 18 years past. Alden pointed directly at the rolled parchment. In Lord Giles's hands, examine the wax seal on that document. Is it not the exact same crest currently used by this very court today? Sheriff Thorne's hand froze in midair. For the first time, a visible crack appeared in Lord Giles's arrogant sneer. Thorne slowly took the parchment and stared at the red wax. The seal that should have belonged to a sheriff from 18 years ago was identical to the one sitting on his own desk. It was undeniable proof that the writ had been forged mere days ago. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of peasants and villagers. Before Lord Giles could recover his wits and speak, Alden seized the moment. I call upon a witness to stand before this court. A witness? From the far corner of the courtyard, an elderly village peasant stepped forward, his legs trembling beneath his worn tunic. It was Tom, the only man in the village who had promised Alden he would testify. Tom dropped to his knees before the sheriff's elevated seat. His body shook, but his voice rang out clear and true. I am Tom, a humble man who has worked the soil of this manor for 30 years. Lord Giles seized 30 acres of my barley fields and forced me to pay them the crown's tax twice over in silver pennies. Lord Giles roared in fury. This old fool speaks madness. Where is your proof? But then, a miraculous thing happened. Behind old Tom, another villager stood up. Then a second. Then a third. He took my lands, too. We paid the tax twice in silver. Yet he demanded more. The villagers, who had kept their mouths shut in terror until yesterday, were pushed forward by the courage of one old man. One by one, they began to raise their voices. The courtyard erupted into a chaotic clamor. Riding the crest of that wave, Clara stepped forward, though she was still bound in thick hemp ropes. Her voice did not waver for a second. I kept the ledgers in Lord Giles's manor hall. I wrote them myself.
The courtyard instantly fell dead silent. The taxes were divided into two streams, Clara continued. One was the official ledger meant for the crown authority, and the other was a secret ledger detailing the wealth Lord Giles hoarded for himself.
I wrote both ledgers with my own hands. Sheriff Thorne's face drained of all color,
Turning as white as winter snow. Clara did not stop. And that is not all. Half of the silver coins meant for the king's treasury were split between Lord Giles and Sheriff Thorne. I recorded every single shilling of that stolen wealth in the secret book. With those words, the courtyard exploded like a kicked hornet's nest. Sheriff Thorne leaped up from his heavy wooden chair, screaming. Lies! The mad ravings of a runaway peasant! Who would believe the words of a low-born girl? Lord Giles joined the shouting, his face purple with rage. She is slandering her rightful master. Silence her at once. But Clara stood her ground, her chin held high. It is no lie. I copied the secret ledger myself. I have the proof. Alden looked at Clara and gave a firm nod. Clara reached into the folds of her wool dress and pulled out a rolled parchment. It was the very document she had risked her life to copy in the dead of night. This is an exact copy of the land registry and tax records kept hidden in the sheriff's own archive. Clara unrolled the parchment for all to see. It detailed the dates of tax collection, the exact amounts of silver pennies, extorted twice over, and the precise sums diverted from the king's royal carriages. Sheriff Thorne looked as though he had seen a ghost. That was stolen from my court. It cannot be used as evidence. Alden's response was as sharp as a drawn broadsword. You have just spoken a grave truth, Sheriff Thorne. Thorne froze. Alden turned his back to the officials and faced the crowd. The sheriff has just admitted with his own lips that this document came directly from his own archive. Does that not prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that its contents are entirely real? Gasps and shouts of astonishment echoed across the stone walls. Thorne had walked right into his own trap. Lord Giles's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and Thorne's legs were visibly shaking beneath his fine robes. Backed into a corner, Thorne played his final desperate hand. Silence! The word of a runaway girl will not dictate the justice of this shire. Thorne stepped down from his dais and bellowed at the manor guards. Garth, Cobb, throw these two in the dungeon at once. I will have them sent to the royal court in chains by morning. The brute servants drew their weapons and lunged toward Alden and Clara. The villagers cried out in protest, but none dared to physically fight them. Armed men of the law. Over the commotion, a voice carried on the wind, praying, "If only a king's man would come." Garth grabbed Alden's arm, twisting it violently, while Cobb grabbed Clara by the shoulder. Clara looked at Alden. Alden looked back at her. In that brief exchange of glances, a silent nod passed between them. It was the signal. The time had come. Just as Garth yanked his arm, Alden violently twisted free. He reached deep into his cloak and pulled something out. It was a heavy, solid royal mandate bearing the unmistakable wax seal of the mighty crown.
Alden raised it high above his head as armed royal cavalry suddenly flooded into the muddy courtyard. "By the authority of the king!" The courtyard froze. The wind seemed to stop. The birds ceased their chirping, and the very breath of the people caught in their throats. The royal seal, polished and heavy, caught the morning sunlight and gleamed brilliantly. That golden light washed over Sheriff Thorne's face, Lord Giles's face, the faces of the brute servants, and every villager gathered in the mud. The moment felt as long as eternity. The silence was finally broken by Sheriff Thorne's legs giving out completely. Unable to support his own weight, he tumbled down the wooden steps of the dais, landing on his hands and knees in the dirt. A king's justice. Thorne pressed his forehead to the muddy ground. Lord Giles's face turned the color of ash. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. The arrogant, greedy lord who had terrorized the Shire was gone, replaced by a pathetic, terrified man shivering in his fine doublet. Garth and Cobb immediately released Alden and Clara, dropping their weapons and falling to their knees. Then a massive roar erupted from the villagers. "A king's justice! The king has sent a justice! Lord have mercy! The wandering scholar was a royal lord all along!" Cheers and tears of joy shook the courtyard. Clara stood perfectly still, staring blankly up at Alden. The ragged scholar she had begged to pretend to be her husband in front of the roadside soup stall. He was a high-born lord, carrying the king's absolute authority. Tears began to stream down Clara's face, warm and heavy. Alden pulled a sealed parchment from his coat and read it aloud, his voice echoing with absolute command. "These are the words of the king. I am commanded to investigate the corruption, extortion, and cruelty committed by the sheriff and the manor lord of the Shire, and to deliver the crown's justice without mercy." As Alden read the royal decree, the courtyard fell into a reverent hush. Sheriff Thorne sobbed, his face buried in the dirt. "My lord, I beg for mercy. Have pity on me. I was led astray." Lord Giles screamed in a panic. "It is a frame-up. It is all a lie spun by that runaway peasant girl." "You have no proof," Alden cut him off, his voice cold as ice. "No proof? A forged writ of bondage, a copied secret ledger, the sworn testimonies of the village peasants, and the sheriff's own confession regarding the stolen documents. Do you truly believe there is any hole left for you to crawl through?" Lord Giles's mouth snapped shut. Alden delivered the sentence. "Sheriff Thorne is hereby stripped of his title. He shall be sent to the royal castle in chains to face the king's justice in the high court. Lord Giles shall be stripped of all his wealth and properties. Every acre of stolen land shall be returned to its rightful owner, and he shall be banished from this realm forever." The king's men moved in, binding Thorne and Giles with the very thick hemp, the ropes they had meant for Clara. The villagers watched in awe as the men who had ruled them with iron fists were dragged away with their heads bowed in disgrace. Some villagers wept, some cheered wildly, and others simply looked up at the sky in silent prayer. When the sentencing was done, Alden walked slowly over to Clara.
She was still standing there, bound by the rough ropes.
Alden gently took hold of the knots and began to untie them himself. One knot loosened, then another. As the heavy ropes fell away from Clara's wrists, angry red bruises were revealed on her pale skin. "You are no longer a runaway," Alden said, his voice low and incredibly warm. Clara's tears would not stop falling. Her legs finally gave way, and she began to sink to her knees in the dirt. But Alden reached out, catching her gently by the shoulders and lifting her back to her feet. "Do not kneel," Alden said, looking deeply into her eyes. "You are the one who saved this town. You are not the one who should be kneeling. You are the one who should be receiving bows." Hearing this, the villagers gathered in the courtyard began to bow their heads, one by one, showing their deep respect to the brave young woman. Clara stood tall. She was barefoot, but her bindings were gone, and the bright spring sunlight poured down upon her face. Alden spoke softly to her. There is still one thing left to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the sapphire crest pin. "We must clear the name of your mother's noble house." Clara's story is not yet finished. A few days passed, and the landscape of the Shire began to change entirely. The fields that Lord Giles had stolen were returned to the peasants, and the silver pennies he had double taxed were refunded to every household. Empty, barren lands were filled with workers once more, and the sound of iron hoes striking the earth rang out across the valley. Color returned to the cheeks of the starving children, and laughter echoed through the muddy market square once again. Walking past the edge of the village, an elderly peasant looked up at the sky, and muttered to himself, I can finally breathe again." It was old Tom, the very first man who had found the courage to stand up in the courtyard. The Shire was coming back to life, slowly but surely, like the arrival of spring after a long, brutal winter. Meanwhile, back at the manor hall, Alden was finishing his final duties. Standing before the newly appointed temporary magistrate, Alden placed Clara's forged writ of bondage on the heavy oak desk. "This document was created through deceit and forgery," Alden stated. "This young woman is not a runaway peasant, but a freeborn citizen who was unlawfully bound by lies." The new magistrate nodded in agreement and pressed a heavy iron stamp over the wax, declaring the writ null and void. Alden picked up the parchment and handed it to Clara. "Burn it yourself." Clara took the cursed parchment with trembling hands. She walked over to a small iron brazier burning in the center of the courtyard. As she held the edge of the parchment to the flames, the fire eagerly consumed it. The ink spelling her name warped in the heat, and the word peasant turned to gray ash, crumbling away into the wind. The invisible chains that had bound Clara like an animal for 18 years turned into smoke and drifted up toward the heavens. Clara watched the flames dance, tears streaming down her face. She was not crying out of sadness. For the first time since she was born, Clara felt like a true human being. Shortly after, Alden rode for the royal castle in the capital. Using the unique noble seal engraved on Clara's sapphire crestpin as a clue, he began digging into the kingdom's deepest archives. searching for records of Eleanor's noble house that had been accused of treason decades ago. He scoured dusty, forgotten scrolls in the crown's library, tracked down the aging lords who had been involved in the original trial, and personally drafted a formal petition for royal clemency. The process was grueling. The records from decades past were buried under layers of dust and bureaucracy, and the political rivals who had ruined Eleanor's family still held power in the royal court. But Alden did not back down. He stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights by candlelight, perfecting the petition until it was finally placed directly upon the king's table. Moved by the evidence, the king ordered a full reinvestigation. The truth finally came to light. Eleanor's noble family was entirely innocent. They had been framed by corrupt rivals who had forged a treasonous diplomatic treaty to steal their lands. The truth of the treasonous plot was finally laid bare before the crown authority. The king's royal decree of clemency was issued without delay. The noble house of Eleanor was fully restored to its former honor, and Clara, once a runaway peasant girl, treated as mere property, was rightfully recognized as a high-born lady of the realm. The tiny hidden crest carved into the sapphire silver pin, the desperate, the dying wish of a mother who had dragged her ailing body to carve those letters, one by one, so that her daughter might one day find justice, had finally reached the light of the world. Months passed. The monthly market fair returned to the muddy market square of the village. There, sitting on the very same wooden bench by the roadside inn where Clara had first thrown herself into Alden's arms, a young woman waited. She wore a fine, clean wool dress, her hair neatly bound beneath a modest coif and gleaming proudly in her hair was the sapphire silver pin. It was Clara. She had ordered a bowl of warm barley soup, but left it untouched, her eyes fixed entirely on the road leading into the market. How much time had passed? Through the bustling crowd of merchants and peasants, a lone figure was walking toward her. He was no longer dressed as a wandering parish scholar in a frayed cloak. This man wore the fine tunic, heavy velvet mantle, and polished leather of a high-ranking kingsman. Yet his steady stride and the deep, unwavering gaze in his eyes belonged to the very same man Clara had looked upon so many times before. Clara stood up. Alden drew near, and the two stood facing one another. The warm steam from the hearth fire and the bowls of soup rose gently between them, carrying the scent of winter fire and roasted oats. Clara was the first to speak. "Will you be my true husband this time, my lord?" Alden paused. His mind drifted back to the very first time he had laid eyes on this woman, by this exact roadside inn. He remembered the desperate, barefoot girl, her feet torn and bleeding, throwing herself at him, gripping his worn cloak with trembling hands and begging him with a tear-choked voice to just pretend to be her husband. He was Alden, the royal assize justice. Yet the way he looked at Clara had not changed in the slightest. His eyes held the same quiet warmth as they had on that fateful, rain-soaked day. For the first time, Alden smiled a wide, radiant smile. To see such a bright, unguarded expression on the face of a man known for his stoic and cold demeanor was a sight the village folk had never witnessed.
"I played the false husband well enough," Alden said softly.
"Surely I can do even better as the true one." Clara laughed.
And as she laughed, she wept. Tears of profound joy shimmered through them.
Rising steam of the barley soup. That autumn, a wedding was held at the old stone church in the village. It was not an overly lavish affair filled with excessive noble pageantry, but it was warmer and more joyous than any feast the manor had ever seen. Clara's hair was adorned with Eleanor's sapphire silver pin. During her days as a hunted runaway, she had not dared to wear it,
forced to keep it hidden deep within her bodice. Now she wore it proudly for all the world to see. The villagers gathered around the church doors, offering their heartfelt blessings and sharing in the festival bread and ale. A bond forged in the muddy market square has become true, one woman whispered. The false husband became the true husband. Tom, the elderly village peasant, wiped a tear from his wrinkled cheek with a rough hand and spoke up. "It is because of that brave lass that our village was saved. We shouldn't just be cheering for her. We should be bowing in gratitude." Amidst the ringing of the chapel bells, Alden leaned in and whispered softly to
"Clara, I am truly your husband now."
Instead of a spoken reply, Clara gently reached out and took hold of Alden's sleeve, just like that desperate day at the market when she had gripped his cloak. But this time, her hands held no trembling fear, only profound warmth, trust, and enduring love. From that day forward, a beloved legend was passed down. Around the hearth fires and at the roadside inn of the village market, they told the tale of a spring day when a barefoot runaway girl, fleeing for her life, grabbed a stranger by his cloak and pleaded, "Please, just pretend to be my husband." And they told of how that stranger returned, become her true husband. Whenever the village elders recounted this tale over cups of mead, they would always add a solemn thought. What would have happened if that scholar had turned a blind eye and walked away? The lass would have been dragged off to a terrible fate, and this entire village would still be bleeding under the cruel boot of Giles. It just goes to show the fate of the world changes with a single choice. It is said that the innkeeper never removed that old wooden bench. He left it exactly as it was, the very place where the two of them had first met. The true value of a human soul is not dictated by the station of their birth. Clara was treated as a peasant, a lowborn whose very name was written on a lord's parchment, as if she were a mere piece of property to be bought and sold. But Clara was different. Even in the face of death, she never gave up. She found the courage to throw herself into the arms of a stranger. And even when threatened with the dungeon and the lash, she possessed a heart grand enough to think of a cause greater than her own survival. A single hand reached out in a desperate moment, completely altered the course of a person's life, and that one person's unyielding courage overturned the tragic destiny of an entire manor. Is there someone standing before you right now, reaching out a trembling hand?
Or perhaps has the moment arrived for you to be
The one to reach out your hand to someone in need?
We can see the figures of the two lovers as they leave the village market behind. They are walking side by side. Clara, who used to follow half a step behind him, in fear, now walks proudly right beside Alden. The sapphire silver pin in Clara's hair catches the soft, golden light of the afternoon sun, gleaming beautifully, and their hands are naturally, comfortably intertwined. A breathtaking sunset spreads across the sky behind the market. The barefoot runaway and the shabby scholar who once shared a meager bowl of soup. Those two are now looking in the exact same direction, walking the same path. There is no longer any blood on Clara's feet, and there is no longer a hidden royal writ of authority concealed within Alden's coat, with nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. Their footsteps carry them past the edge of the market and out toward the open, rolling fields of the manor. The golden light of the setting sun paints their silhouettes with long strokes of color, and their shadows merging into one, slowly fade into the horizon beyond the meadows. A grand tale that began with a single desperate plea. Please, just pretend to be my husband, has come to its beautiful conclusion. A single letter carved into a silver pin by a dying mother changed her daughter's life decades later, and a single hand reached out at a humble soup stall brought down the deep-rooted corruption of an entire manor. There will surely be moments like this in the world we live in. Whether you choose to walk past someone's desperate plea or take a step closer to help, that choice might just rewrite the story of your own life. I will return next time with another unforgettable tale from the old roads. If you wish to ensure you do not miss the next story, please subscribe, leave a like, and set your notifications. And if you know of any other stirring tales of old, please share them with us in the comments below.